If you always remove every sucker you see on your tomato plants and cucumbers, because someone once told you that more pruning always means a better harvest, then you may have been cutting away some of the most productive growth your plants could ever give you. I made that same mistake for years, and every season I wondered why my neighbors were carrying home baskets full of vegetables while I was standing there looking at healthy leaves but fewer fruits than I expected. The strange part is that the plants were trying to help me all along, but I kept getting in their way because I believed the advice that everyone repeats without stopping to really watch what the plants are doing. That is why I want to share something that completely changed the way I grow tomatoes and cucumbers. And it did not cost me a single dollar. It only required paying closer attention and leaving one small piece of the plant alone instead of cutting it off. Most gardeners think every side shoot steals energy from the plant. But that is only part of the story, because some of those shoots become the very branches that keep producing flowers and fruit long after the main stem begins to slow down. I learned this from an older gardener many years ago, and at first I honestly thought he was wrong because his plants looked fuller than mine. Then summer came, and while my vines were already slowing down, his garden kept producing week after week. That was the moment I realized I had been following a habit instead of understanding the plant. Today, I want to show you exactly which sucker I never remove anymore, and why the answer is different for tomatoes and cucumbers, even though many people treat them the same way. You do not need expensive fertilizer or special seeds, and you certainly do not need complicated tricks. You only need to recognize one simple piece of growth that most people cut away without thinking. Once you see it, you will never look at your plants the same way again, because this one small decision can mean more flowers, more fruit, and a harvest that lasts much longer than you expected. Before we get to that point, though, there is one mistake almost everyone makes in the very first weeks of the growing season. And if you miss it, nothing else I tell you today will work the way it should. The first thing I always look at is not the size of the plant, but where that new growth is appearing, because this is where most gardeners make the wrong decision. They see a fresh shoot growing between the main stem and a branch, and they remove it immediately because they have heard that every sucker steals strength from the plant. I used to do exactly the same thing, and every time I felt satisfied because the plants looked clean and neat. The problem was that neat plants were not always the plants giving me the biggest harvest. After watching my own garden for several seasons, I noticed something that surprised me. The tomato plants where I left one carefully chosen sucker near the lower middle part of the plant stayed productive much longer than the ones I pruned heavily. That extra stem slowly became a strong backup branch. When the original stem became tired from carrying heavy fruit, the second stem was just reaching its best stage, and it continued producing fresh flowers. Very few people do this because they remove everything before giving the plant a chance to show what it can become. Cucumbers taught me another lesson because they do not behave exactly like tomatoes. Many modern cucumber varieties produce female flowers on their side shoots, and those flowers become the cucumbers you are hoping to harvest. If you remove every side shoot without understanding your variety, you may actually be cutting away tomorrow's harvest before it even has a chance to appear. This does not mean you should let every shoot grow everywhere, because that creates another problem with poor airflow and crowded vines. The old gardener who showed me this never told me to stop pruning. He simply told me to prune with a reason instead of following a rule that fits every plant. That advice stayed with me because it made sense the moment I stopped rushing. I now spend a few extra minutes looking carefully before I make a single cut. That small habit costs nothing, and it has saved me from removing healthy growth that would later carry flowers and fruit. Most people make the mistake right here because they are trying to finish the job quickly instead of reading what the plant is telling them. In the next part, I will show you the simple signs I use to decide which sucker stays and which one goes. Because once you learn those signs, the choice becomes much easier, and your plants begin working with you instead of against you. Many years ago, an older man in my town invited me to look at his vegetable garden because I could not understand why his harvest always seemed to last weeks longer than everyone else's. His tomato plants were not perfectly trimmed, and his cucumber vines looked more natural than the ones I was growing. At first, I honestly thought he had simply forgotten to prune them. Then he smiled and asked me one question that I have never forgotten. He said, "If every sucker is a mistake, then why does the plant keep making them?" I stood there for a moment because I had no good answer. Instead of giving me a long lecture, he walked over to one tomato plant and pointed at a strong side shoot growing below the first heavy cluster of fruit. He told me that this was the one he almost never removed, because once the main stem became busy feeding large tomatoes, this second stem would quietly take over and keep the season going. He called it the plant's insurance policy. Then he took me to the cucumber bed and showed me something else that I had completely missed. The first part of the vine was producing mostly leaves and early flowers, but many of the healthiest female flowers appeared later on the side shoots that so many gardeners remove without thinking. He said nature is usually trying to solve problems before we even notice them, and sometimes our job is simply not to interrupt. That afternoon changed the way I looked at pruning forever because I stopped trying to force every plant into the same shape. Instead, I started watching how each one wanted to grow. During the next season, I decided to test his advice instead of arguing with it. On some plants, I followed my old habit and removed every sucker. On others, I left one carefully chosen shoot exactly where he had shown me. By the middle of summer, the difference became impossible to ignore. The plants with one extra productive stem stayed greener longer and continued setting fresh flowers while the heavily pruned plants slowed down much earlier. I was not using different fertilizer and I was not watering more often. The only real difference was one simple decision made early in the season. Very few people ever try this comparison because they believe the answer before they have seen the result with their own eyes. That is why I always tell people not to trust me immediately. Try it on just one or two plants and let the garden give you the answer, because in the next part I will show you exactly how I choose the one sucker that stays without turning the plant into a tangled mess. Now let me show you exactly how I decide which sucker stays, because this is where the biggest difference is made. I never leave the decision until the plant is already crowded with thick branches, because by then it is much harder to guide the growth. I begin looking when the tomato plant is healthy and growing steadily. I find the first strong flower cluster, and then I look just below it for a healthy side shoot that is growing well and pointing outward instead of into the middle of the plant. If I find one like that, I leave it alone and remove the weaker suckers below it. This gives the plant one extra productive stem instead of 5 or 6 weak ones fighting for the same space. That one stem receives plenty of light and fresh air, and it becomes strong enough to carry heavy fruit later in the season. Most gardeners either remove every sucker or leave every sucker, and both approaches usually create unnecessary problems. The old method I learned is about balance rather than following strict rules. Cucumbers require the same careful thinking, but for a different reason. When I inspect my cucumber vines, I never rush to remove every side shoot. Instead, I first look for healthy flower buds, because many of those side shoots will soon produce female flowers that become cucumbers. If I remove them too early, I lose fruit before I ever have the chance to harvest it. What I do remove are weak, damaged, or overcrowded shoots that block airflow or grow into a tangled mass. That simple difference keeps the vines open enough to stay healthier while still allowing them to produce naturally. Very few people take the time to watch how each vine develops because they are trying to finish pruning in one visit. I prefer spending a few quiet minutes every several days instead of making dozens of cuts all at once. That habit has given me far better results than aggressive pruning ever did. Another small secret that was shown to me many years ago is to use clean, sharp pruners every single time, because rough cuts heal slowly and create unnecessary stress for the plant. Healthy clean cuts disappear quickly and allow the plant to keep growing without wasting energy. None of these steps cost money, and none of them require special equipment. They only require patience and careful observation. In the next part, I want to show you the small mistakes that still reduce harvest, even after you have chosen the right sucker, because this is where many gardeners unknowingly lose the extra production they worked so hard to protect. Even after I learned which sucker to keep, I still made mistakes that quietly reduced my harvest, because I thought the hard part was over. It was not. One of the biggest mistakes was letting that extra stem grow without any support. As it became heavier with flowers and fruit, it started leaning away from the main plant, and one strong summer storm almost snapped it completely off. Since then, I always tie that stem gently to a stake or a string while it is still flexible. I never pull it tightly because plants need room to move with the wind. A little support today can save weeks of growing later. Another mistake that many people make happens after pruning. They remove a few shoots and immediately water the leaves from above. Wet leaves combined with fresh cuts can encourage disease, especially during warm, humid weather. I always water the soil instead of the foliage, and I try to prune on a dry morning when the plant has the whole day to heal naturally. That simple habit has kept my tomatoes and cucumbers much healthier over the years. There is another detail that very few people notice. Sometimes a tomato plant naturally tells you that the main stem is slowing down. The newest leaves become smaller and the flower clusters appear less often. This is exactly when that carefully chosen sucker begins proving its value because it is already growing into a strong, productive branch. While the original stem starts losing energy, the new one is just beginning its most productive period. If you had removed it weeks earlier, you would never receive that second wave of tomatoes. Cucumbers have their own version of this lesson. Many gardeners become excited when the first cucumbers appear, and they stop paying attention to the rest of the vine. Meanwhile, the side shoots continue developing new flowers that can keep the harvest going for many more weeks if they are not removed too soon. I also avoid removing too many leaves at one time because the leaves are feeding the fruit every single day. If I need better airflow, I remove only a few older leaves during each visit instead of stripping the plant all at once. The garden rewards patience much more often than speed. Most people make the mistake right here because they think more pruning always means more production. My experience has shown the opposite. Careful selective pruning almost always gives me healthier plants and a longer harvest. In the final part, I want to show you how this one simple change completely transformed the way I grow tomatoes and cucumbers every season, and why I will never go back to my old habit again. The difference this one small change made in my garden did not appear overnight, but once I noticed it, I could never ignore it again. My tomato plants stayed productive well after I expected them to slow down, and my cucumber vines kept giving me fresh fruit when many other gardens around me were already losing momentum. Friends would ask if I had found a new fertilizer or some expensive product from the garden center. I would just smile because the answer was much simpler than that. I had finally stopped cutting away growth that the plant was planning to use. That lesson changed the way I looked at every pruning decision. Instead of asking what I should remove, I started asking what the plant was trying to accomplish. That simple question saved me from making many unnecessary cuts. Another thing I noticed was that harvesting became easier because the plant stayed balanced instead of becoming weak at the top and empty at the bottom. The extra productive stem helped spread the fruit across the plant, so the weight was not carried by only one main stem. That also meant fewer broken branches during windy weather and less stress on the plant through the hottest weeks of summer. Cucumbers rewarded the same patience. As long as I kept picking the mature fruit regularly and allowed the healthy side shoots to continue growing, the vines kept producing new flowers almost as if they were determined to keep going. Very few gardeners stay patient enough to watch this happen because they assume the first harvest is also the biggest harvest. In my experience, the second and even third waves often become just as satisfying when the plants are managed carefully. One more habit has become part of my routine over the years. Every few days, I walk through the garden without carrying any tools. I simply look at the plants. I notice which stems are growing strongly where new flowers are forming, and whether anything looks crowded. Only after I finish observing do I return with my pruners if they are actually needed. That quiet habit has probably prevented more mistakes than any gardening book I have ever read. It costs nothing and takes only a few minutes, but it allows the plants to tell me what they need instead of forcing them into my own plan. In the final part, I want to leave you with the simple rule that guides every pruning decision I make today. Because once you understand that rule, you will look at tomatoes and cucumbers with completely different eyes every single season. When I look back at all the seasons I have spent in the garden, I realize that some of my biggest improvements did not come from buying something new. They came from stopping a habit that never should have become a habit in the first place. Removing every sucker without thinking was one of those habits. Today, I know that every plant deserves a few quiet moments before I make a cut, because once a healthy stem is gone, I cannot put it back. Tomatoes and cucumbers are both generous plants when we give them the chance to grow the way they were designed. They do not ask for expensive products or complicated systems. They ask us to pay attention. That is why I encourage you not to change your whole garden at once. Choose one tomato plant and one cucumber plant this season. Leave the carefully selected sucker that we talked about today and compare it with the plants you pruned the old way. Watch how they grow. Count the flowers, count the fruit. Notice how long each plant stays productive. I believe your own garden will give you a better answer than anything I could ever say. That is how I learned, and it is how I still learn every single year. Gardening is not about proving that we already know everything. It is about noticing small changes that quietly lead to bigger harvests. That is one of the reasons I still enjoy walking through the garden every morning, because there is always something new to notice even after many years. I save money because I waste less. I harvest more because I remove less, and I enjoy the work because I no longer rush through it. If today's story helps you save even one productive stem, then your tomatoes and cucumbers may thank you with weeks of extra harvest that you almost cut away by mistake. Keep observing before cutting, and let the plants teach you a little more every season. In our next video, I want to show you another old gardening habit that many people stopped using, even though it can improve plant health without costing anything at all. Until then, take care of your garden, one careful step at a time, because sometimes the smallest decision is the one that fills the biggest basket at harvest time.